The term plot refers to the events that happen within the story. Most often, we use a plot diagram to show those sequence of events, since they typically happen in the same order. A plot starts with the exposition, then going into the rising action, peaks at the climax, falls down to the falling action, and ends with the resolution. The conflict happens throughout the story. The conflict is the problem that takes place within the story. It is a struggle between two opposing forces. There are different types of conflict. Conflicts can be external, meaning person versus person, when a person has a problem with another person and they must work to solve it. Another conflict is person versus nature, meaning a person is going up against something happening within nature, such as an animal, a weather event, or anything else that would happen outside. You can also have person versus society, meaning one person is trying to change something that is happening within a government or larger society as a whole. You can also have an internal conflict, meaning person versus themselves. Something is going on that they have to resolve their feelings for. Throughout this presentation, I'll be using the classic Cinderella as an example. In Cinderella, the conflict is person versus person. Cinderella's stepfamily is against her. They are very unkind to her and they don't want her going to the ball. The exposition of a story is when the author is explaining the setting, which is the time and place, and the characters, your protagonists and antagonists. They are introducing them to you so you understand them throughout the rest of the story. The exposition of Cinderella is when you find out more about her family. She lives with her stepsisters and stepmother, and they make her very unhappy by making her work throughout the house and being very mean to her. In the exposition, you also find out more about the plot. It is introduced to you. You learn that an invitation is being sent around to all the ladies of the kingdom for a ball at the palace. The rising action occurs after the exposition, and you get to know more about the plot. This is a series of events that lead up to the turning point or the highest point of suspense. This particularly happens when the protagonist is struggling to overcome the conflict of the story. The rising action of Cinderella has quite a few events. The stepsisters start to prepare for the ball, but Cinderella really wants to go along. Her fairy godmother comes along to try to make that happen. She eventually does get to go to the ball and dances with the prince. In Cinderella's haste to leave the ball, she steps out of her glass slipper. The prince finds it and says she will marry the woman who will fit into the shoe. The climax of a story is the highest suspense or the turning point. Sometimes it is the highest point of action, but that depends on the story. This is often when the protagonist makes a critical discovery, something that turns the whole point of the story around. In Cinderella, the climax is when the stepsisters are trying to force their foot into the shoe, but it doesn't fit. Then comes Cinderella. It fits her perfectly. During the falling action, the conflict is starting to be resolved. You see a resolution coming soon. In Cinderella, the falling action is when the Cinderella and the prince marry. Resolution is the end of the story. The conflict is completely resolved. You find out what will happen to the characters at the end, and you find out the moral or message of the story. In Cinderella, the resolution is quite simple. They live happily ever after, and the reader is left with the theme that happiness is truly possible if you believe. There are some things to keep in mind about plot diagrams. For example, not all stories have every part of the plot. Some stories are missing the resolution. They do not have an ending. This is done on purpose. Maybe there's a sequel. There can be more than one conflict to a story. Oftentimes, you will have an external conflict that leads to an internal conflict. A person has to deal with their thoughts and feelings about something that happened they couldn't change. The plot diagram is highly favored toward the rising action, meaning the rising action often has many events within it. That is because the rising action contain events that happen as a result of the conflict. Oftentimes, the exposition, the climax, falling action, and resolution would only contain one or two events, and that is okay.